Welcome to all the participants in this panel, which is focused on implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And my name is Kate Brown. I'm with the Global Island Partnership, and I'm going to moderate this session. Just to remind people to make sure that you're on mute as we go through, but we will have opportunity for you to ask questions through the chat. So if you think of things while the presentations and discussion is underway, please put them there and we will ask questions to our speakers. We have an amazing panel of 3 speakers from obviously Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And I wanted to start with some framing remarks. So although islands are at the front lines of climate change with sea level rise and extreme weather events impacting their economies and ways of life, they are also pioneering place-based solutions that can be scaled globally. And this panel will really showcase how island efforts and partnerships can drive local action on the Sustainable Development Goals, climate solutions, equity and environment initiatives. This breakout session is connected to a plenary that will follow at 3:15, so I encourage you to join it, as you'll hear a more global perspective on some of these issues and some exciting new global initiatives on this subject. And in both, we are looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and local implementation examples. To help set the scene for that, I will play a short video that explains why the global goals are important and relevant and why we should care about them.
The United Nations General Assembly was the scene of a celebration in 2015, when 193 member countries adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, a unanimous commitment to end poverty, fight inequality, and tackle climate change.
We need action from everyone, everywhere. 17 Sustainable Development Goals are our guide. They are a to-do list for people and planet, and the blueprint for success.
The SDGs are an agenda to balance human prosperity with protecting the planet.
Imagine there's no countries.
UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador Shakira asked global leaders to imagine a world where we achieve the goals by 2030. While fellow UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador Angelique Kidjo underscored a focus on Africa and developing countries. But the universal agenda is important to all nations, as leaders from developed countries also pledged to make the goals a reality.
Poverty, growing inequality exists in all of our nations, and all of our nations have work to do, and that includes here in the United States. And that's why today I am committing the United States to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
The Sustainable Development Goals build on the success of another 15-year plan. Created in the year 2000, the Millennium Development Goals sunset at the end of 2015. The MDGs halved extreme poverty, achieved equal primary education for girls and boys, and dropped HIV infection by 40%, among many successes. The SDGs go beyond the MDGs by improving the lives of everyone, everywhere, and create a better world for future generations.
Today, we are 193 young people representing billions more.
The youngest Nobel Peace Laureate, Malala, calls on world leaders to keep their promise to every child.
Each lantern we hold represents the hope we have for our future because of the commitments you have made to the global goals.
And Pope Francis advised world leaders to put humanity and the environment over politics.
Los gobernantes han de hacer todo lo posible a fin de que todos puedan tener la mínima base material y espiritual para ejercer su dignidad y para formar y mantener una familia.
193 nations unanimously committed to the Sustainable Development Goals.
It is so decided.
But the journey starts here. Now's the time to take global action for local results and move our people and planet towards a sustainable future.
And thank you for that. And so there we see what the relevance at the global level is of the Sustainable Development Goals and where they come from. Now we're going to see what the SDGs look like at the local level in Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And with that, I'm going to ask our first speaker, we're going to have some framing remarks from the speakers, and then we're going to get into question and answer session. But I'll ask our first speaker to take us through his presentation. I'd like to introduce Lloyd Gardner, who is the president for the Foundation for Development Planning in the Virgin Islands. So over to you, Lloyd.
Thank you, Kate. Good afternoon, colleagues. I will attempt to present a context for how implementation of the SDGs would work in the USVI. My colleague will no doubt get into more of the details as is in the policy process. But I'd like to present a context so how it could actually be approached. Next slide. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about is our understanding of development. It is not, typically we focus on generating revenues. We use development, like many places, to talk about what we build, how the built environment looks, and the great things that are happening. As we know globally, that you can have a country with a high level of GDP, large economy, and there's significant inequality, and the development goals or the targets you set for a range of different goals are not met. That we know that. And so you find that certainly in small economies, in developing countries, we do not necessarily speak in terms of development goals and targets. The language and programs and policies in the US Virgin Islands do not reflect an overall understanding of the need to design long-term strategies and to translate those strategies to improving the quality of life of the people of the territory. This is not unique to the Virgin Islands, of course, but it is part of the context that we need to understand, that the language we use and the policies that we develop need to speak to these kinds of issues. The second is program silos, typical of many places where we have programs that are narrowly defined and implemented, and they might work very well, but as we always talk about integrating programs and policies and policy coherence, and this is one of the issues here as well, that the extent to which programs don't overlap or do not build on each other, then we reduce the potential for significant advancement in those goals. Governance, there is a general paternalistic attitude in the public sector towards community and community organizations, and many places the government knows best and they will take care of it. And there's a general distrust of civil society organizations participating in that development process. However, in the US Virgin Islands, like many small islands, civil society, different groups play significant roles in the growth of society, in maintaining the stability of these societies, certainly under, what should I say, times when there's significant disruption. So to bridge that gap, we want to focus on what we call the infrastructure of government, the capacity to sort of formulate and deliver public policy, to create an appropriate enabling environment that has significant decision-making capabilities, that maintain this governance process that we talked about, I mentioned before, and has the ability to anticipate and withstand shocks. We don't want a government, nobody wants a government that first time there's an economic shock or there's a natural disaster, the system falls apart. So you want the government to play that sort of lead role in maintaining across the different social sectors, systems that function. One of the issues to be addressed within the US Virgin Islands is this idea of the vision of community. Essentially, if you don't know what your community is and what you want it to be, setting development goals for that community can be very difficult. And we tend to focus here on our relationship with the larger country, and certainly on who is a Virgin Islander. In the past and currently, we speak a lot about, and there's a lot of debate about who is a Virgin Islander, what does that mean, but less about what the Virgin Islands community should be, what would we like it to be, what would anyone coming in from the outside, looking on, recognize it as being. And so this is one of the issues that I think we have to grapple with, and as we translate that to goals. The process, designing and these processes require participation of all of the society, and participatory decision-making is not typical. As I said before, there's this paternalistic approach that is typical of governments in small spaces. And there are a lot of small groups, and there are people who are marginalized or vulnerable. And therefore, the design of the process that we use for determining sustainable development goals and the strategies must be based on an acceptance of ideas of shared governance, equality, and justice. Next slide. These are, you're looking at opportunities as I see them immediately for translating or what should I say, not translating, discussing the sustainable development goals and trying to build that into current policies. So the land and water use plan is supposed to be underdeveloped. There's supposed to be a new one being developed. And within that process, land and water use plan in most places, or land use plan, is a translation of social and economic planning into physical space. And so to do that, there's usually what is called a development plan that gets translated into this physical plan. And the process of preparing a development plan usually involves these discussions about education and health and economy and all of those things. And so that process, I think, allows us to have that kind of discussion, and therefore, what would development goals look like? And the Vision 2040 is an economic development strategy for the US Virgin Islands, supposed to be over, 20 years. And that now needs to be translated into action. And I think as different groups come to this process, it allows the government and the society to have those discussions, whether in terms of the vision itself or in terms of specific strategies that will be implemented. And so, again, an opportunity to move the discussion in that era. 3, the new laws establishing the Virgin Islands Information Management System was just signed about 2 weeks ago by the government. And basically that moves a project that was funded for into sort of mainstreaming legislatively in terms of information management around a range of issues, health, education, etc. And so this offers a potential for providing data that can be accessed and can be used to track progress in a number of areas in terms of development of the society. The Foundation for Development Planning, the institution that I represent, actually is developing a proposal to conduct a voluntary local review for the Virgin Islands. We have initiated some discussions with the government about that, but we are early in that debate discussion, and so we'll see what happens. There's a lot happening, just like the Puerto Rico, recovering from 2 Category 5 storms. We're in the middle of that process, and there's a lot happening. And so the more capacity that the rest of the community bring to the process, I think it will be useful to all of us, certainly to the government, as opposed to all of us looking to the government to do it all. Next slide. Finally, I want to share this graphic with you. This is from, as you can see from might be to the right of your screen, the source of this graphic from a technical paper presented by the UN, prepared by the UN, dealing with climate change. And so the US Virgin Islands, like Puerto Rico, unlike many Caribbean countries, exhibit high levels of vulnerability to natural disasters. We are subjected to external shock, external economic shock created elsewhere. But we recognize that climate change is a driver of disaster risk, and economic decisions, of course, can exacerbate or reduce disaster risk. And so the question is, how do we integrate with sustainable development goals, these sort of drivers of risk and decision making and potential prosperity. And so in the context of small island development options, it makes sense to adopt a planning frameworks that essentially integrate these goals. And the question I want to ask all of us is, does this integrated approach using this kind of, that's suggested by the graphic, does that make sense for the Virgin Islands and for Puerto Rico? I think it does. How we get to that space is another issue. And so I would love to get your feedback on this. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Lloyd. And I see a lot of commonality with other islands, a lot of the issues that you raise. So that's awesome. I would like to encourage people also, remember to, if you've got questions or thoughts or things you want clarification on from Lloyd's excellent presentation, please put them in the chat, and then we'll also have an opportunity to ask all of the panel questions shortly. So thank you, Lloyd. Our next speaker is also from the Virgin Islands. We're going to hear from Marlon Hibbert from the Department of Planning and Natural Resources, and he's also the Director of the Division of Coastal Zone Management. So Marlon, you have the floor now.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Kate. I appreciate it. Thank you, participants, for joining, and I hope I have something constructive to contribute to the conversation. So thank you, Lloyd, for providing that excellent overview of context. And I'm just going to move forward with trying to elucidate some small projects that are going on. You will see I have the word progress towards the 17, the USVI perspective. I removed the word March because March suggests a coordinated activity. And as Lloyd said, at this point, it is not the best coordinated activity. We are attaining and we are moving towards some of attaining the SDGs, but we aren't moving in the best coordinated fashion. I hope that this provides the impetus for us to begin that process with participants, with our colleagues in Puerto Rico as well. Next slide, please. So one of the projects that I'm particularly proud, that we are particularly proud of, and which is integrated into a larger project that we have called the VI Clean Coasts, is a very small project that has been incrementally providing, I think, equity and environmental justice, as well as combating issues that small islands faced, as it is regarding solid waste management, reduction in waste that ends up in our nearshore areas. It's called Refill Bottles, not Dumpsters. And it is approaching plastic pollution with our next generation. So we have a program, and in the picture, in the graphic, you see my coordinator in the yellow shirt, who is about the same size as all those elementary school children, sorry, Kitty, has coordinated a program that we are replacing the plastic bottles in schools. So kids usually carry, multiple plastic bottles with them to school. It adds to an already strained solid waste management system. And here we have the provision of clean water stations. So we're adding clean water stations to the schools, as well as providing a personalized brand bottle with a school name that they can personalize, the kids can personalize for themselves, but with the understanding that they must use this now to refresh themselves, to hydrate themselves, but also with the understanding that they're doing their part as young as they are in reducing our imprint on our ecosystems. It is a private and public partnership. It has been graciously funded through some of our federal agencies, particularly NOAA, and also some local corporate entities that have bought into the program. It is currently being organized by one of our local nonprofit organizations, the Virgin Islands Conservation Society, who are doing an excellent job as well with it. And we intend to continue this program. It also involves the certification of businesses that remove plastic waste from their businesses and use biodegradable products. But that's one component of it. But we're particularly proud of this component. Next slide, please. And so we wanted to move on to something else a little bit more on a larger scale. Collaboration between federal and territorial agencies, namely the Virgin Islands Territorial Emergency Management Agency and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as DPNR. Currently, we are developing simultaneously 8 watershed management plans across the territory with a view to providing for flood mitigation in areas that have consistently have repetitive flooding, many of which are in vulnerable communities. The projects are coming up with preliminary designs that would enable us, when we have the implementation funds, and we're fortunate that we are looking to get implementation funds from the same sources, to reduce flooding by doing retention systems, as well as using what would have otherwise been wasted water to provide for water security for communities, for farmers. The graphic on your screen shows the island of St. Croix. The 5 watersheds that are being considered on St. Croix actually cover 45% of the total land area of St. Croix. The opportunities there are tremendous if we are able to do and implement some of the recommendations or many of the recommendations incrementally over time. We will make a huge impact on the community. We're looking at providing the hydrologic characterization, and of course, provide water retention and reuse, and as well reduce pollutant loads that inevitably end up to our nearshore coastal areas. Reducing those impacts improves the resilience of our main economic driver, which is, in fact, tourism. Next slide, please. Here I have an example of public-private partnership in one of those watershed areas. There was earlier today in the plenary, the architect Stacy Bourne mentioned Bolongo Bay. And this is in fact something that we are also very proud of. So Bolongo Bay donated a portion of their property in order to provide flood mitigation strategy or intervention. And we have this pond that with a forebay that is going to take water from a small watershed that usually flows directly out to the ocean, destroys the beach that Bolongo Bay uses for its guests and residents. And what we're having here is, in fact, a donation of land, but paid for through the Department of Public Works, designed in part through a collaboration with a watershed management plan that was prepared a number of years ago by DPNR with DPNR's assistance. And the recommendation was for this to occur, and it's coming to fruition. So we're hoping that this project will serve as a demonstration to the public of what can be done, as well as provide the subsequent benefits to the community as well. Reduce flooding in this area, and of course, reduce pollutants for this area. Next slide, please. And I wanted to touch on something that, again, one of our plenary session presenters mentioned, Dr. Greg Bonnell. Existing but under, as you can see from the title of the slide, is the Virgin Islands, the fact that the Virgin Islands since 1964 has required that residences and commercial buildings not connected to a municipal water system build a rainwater harvesting system. Commonly here in the territory, it is a cistern. I think it's underrated, but I think it's an amazing thing that has been done, because throughout the Caribbean and many other areas we are continuing to struggle with water scarcity. The Virgin Islands is water scarce. But I think that this particular policy has enabled the Virgin Islands to surmount some of those issues, thereby increasing its resilience when we are, in fact, in a situation where we are having longer drought situations, or we have to retain water when we have heavy rains. Cisterns collect a lot of rain that would have normally gone out to stormwater systems, overburdening already small stormwater systems. With cisterns, we collect a lot of that water from impervious surfaces. It needs, I think, modeling elsewhere. I know around the Caribbean region, elsewhere, it's being touted as one way of reducing stormwater as well, but providing for that water security. Next slide, please. And so sustainable consumption as part of the SDGs as well. This is a program that was initiated by the Nature Conservancy and has been taken over by the Division of Fish and Wildlife along with the department. And it's aimed at sustainable consumption, at educating the public about what species can be sustainably consumed, educating the fishermen about their compliance in terms of using the proper gear, educating our restaurants. Who should we buy from? Are these fishermen utilizing the proper gear? The fishermen can become certified, so too can the restaurants become Reef Responsible certified. So again, I think it's an education and awareness program that is requiring us to take a hard look at how we consume and the best way to consume. Next slide, please. And finally, coral restoration activities. As you know, one of the SDG goals is below the waterline. So led by the University of the Virgin Islands, Coral World, the Nature Conservancy, the National Park Service, as well as the government of the Virgin Islands, coral restoration activities have been ongoing for the last 5 to 8 years. We are expected to ramp that up. The university is building out their capacity, so too is the Nature Conservancy with the Coral Restoration Hub in St. Croix. And these efforts are being supported by both federal, territorial, and philanthropic avenues. We expect that over the next few years that we'll have an increase in the scalability of coral restoration activities. And of course, coral restoration will help to provide resilience in shoreline protection for our systems as well. So that's the last slide, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marlon. That was really fascinating. It was great to see some really concrete examples of what the Virgin Islands is doing in this space around the SDGs. Again, everyone, if you have questions or you want clarification, please put it in the chat. We'll move on to our next speaker, who is going to talk to us about Puerto Rico. So we have Ricardo Azuaga, the founder and executive director of the United Nations Association of the USA Puerto Rico chapter, which works with the United Nations Foundation Puerto Rico and the SDGs. So Ricardo, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you so much for the other panelists, Marlon and Lloyd. It is a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon to speak about the SDGs. Of course, we all can relate about the impact of the hurricanes in 2017. It's a recurrent theme, but something that is quite important, shocking for our islands, but has also put us on the right path to align our efforts with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I am going to start, as I am the only representative from Puerto Rico today, I'm going to provide a little bit about the perspective of the US government, the initiatives that it has undertaken to advance the SDGs locally. And then I would use my hat as executive director of the UNA USA to see how are we complementing these efforts with the NGO community, the private sector, academia, and civil society as a whole. Puerto Rico has taken some concrete steps related to the theme of this conference, starting with the Energy Public Policy Act, which was signed into law in 2019. It establishes that the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority has to obtain 40% of its electricity from renewable sources by 2025, 60% by 2040, and 100% by 2050. PREPA is also mandated to phase out coal-fired generation by 2028. It's important to mention that these targets need to be measured. We have to be candid and acknowledge that right now we are around 3% of renewable sources. So therefore, the importance of measuring, which is going to be a recurring theme in this breakout session, as well as in the plenary coming up. Then another important step was the creation of the Committee of Experts and Advisors on Climate Change. It was created on the law as well to outline a mitigation, adaptation, and resilience plan. It is important to note that already 103 courses of action related to coastal zone management have been submitted by this committee, and also 57 on water. So that's those courses of action. It's another area we need to measure, and we have to measure what's important. Each island determines that on their path towards sustainability. And the third step, which is important to mention, is that on April 13, 2021, the government of Puerto Rico became a member of the Local 2030 Islands Network. The network brings together emerging island economies, nation states, and communities from all regions of the globe. It is also important to note that the following week, Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, announced the United States support for this network and its commitment to partnering with small islands in their efforts to combat the climate crisis and building resilience in the face of a changing climate, which of course is the purpose of this two-day conference. So it's important to make the connection on how these decisions trickle down and bring us to this great two-day conference today. So having mentioned the part of government, I am going to highlight what are we doing for the next 10 years, the so-called decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals. And what we have been constructing in collaboration with many other partners and stakeholders in Puerto Rico is how do we translate that very nice video you saw at the beginning to the local level. So government, I'm going to focus now on government and the Local 2030 Island Network, on education, not only universities, but K to 12, private sector, stakeholders, and communications. Starting with the Local 2030 Islands Network that I mentioned before, it's the islands working together for a sustainable future. This was the letter submitted by the government of Puerto Rico, where it supports the 4 principles of the network. I'm going to focus on 2 of them for the purposes of this breakout session, which is identify local goals to advance the SDGs and strengthen long-term political leadership on climate resilience and net zero emission pathways. The legislations that I mentioned before address this, but the other part, which we have to work on, is how to measure SDG progress through tracking and reporting on locally and culturally informed indicators that I mentioned in terms of the courses of action that need to be measured in order to see where we stand. It was great to see during COP26 in Scotland in November, former US President Barack Obama mentioning the support of the Biden administration for the network and highlighting the guest speakers that are going to be in the plenary, Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico, stating that, of course, as we address this conference today, how islands are at the forefront of climate change and why it's important for us to engage and collaborate in this most drastic topic for our planet. And having spoken about government, the other part, education, is very important. So we have developed a collaborative relationship with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network at the United Nations, and the SDSN promotes integrated approaches to implement the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change through education, research, policy analysis, and global cooperation, which is something that we're going to try to bring from theory to practice in this presentation and in the coming decade. As of 2022, it has over 1,600 members in 137 countries. The president of the SDSN is Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, which is the reason that we had him last year on a dialogue between local university presidents on the topic of accelerating education for the SDGs in universities. This was done as the SDSN developed a guide to accelerate education on universities, and the main universities in Puerto Rico participated. It is important to note that Universidad Sagrado Corazón developed last year the first bachelor's degree on sustainable development directly related to the SDGs, and that 2 months after this event, I received a call from the University of Puerto Rico Mayagüez campus and several professors, engineering professors, letting me know that they had developed a bachelor's degree and that they have designed this bachelor's degree on sustainable and resilient engineering. And it's important because, of course, the University of Puerto Rico is our largest educational institution, and that particular engineering school is quite well known around the world. So it is great to see that there's progress in academia regarding the SDGs. This was Professor Sachs during the activity and the press release that was generated. Another important area for us is education K-12. So it was great to see Marlon talking about K-12 education and how it also links with the business sector, as we are also trying to do this. In collaboration also with the SDSN, they have the Global Schools program, which help bring the SDGs to the classroom without having to create a new curriculum. There are already lesson plans in a variety of languages. So we have worked with several schools, high schools and elementary schools, to establish the first case studies about how to bring education on the SDGs to the classrooms in Puerto Rico. Another important part, of course, is private sector. How do we engage the private sector in this important conversation? And the entity that we have selected as our guiding north is the United Nations Global Compact, which is a great initiative, which is basically a framework for responsible business based on UN declarations and conventions. This image that you're seeing here, it's a representative of the Global Compact USA network. And we were the liaison to bring Adam Gordon here to Puerto Rico in collaboration with Invest Puerto Rico, which is, of course, the entity dealing with the foreign direct investment and other investments in Puerto Rico. So it was great that in 2019, Invest Puerto Rico was already thinking about the SDGs and contacted us to collaborate in this presentation during a large conference entitled Puerto Rico is Open for Green Business. So once again, you see the image of the SDGs for Apos Maria, Puerto Rico, also present. And what we have done since then, we have started certifications on sustainability in collaboration with partners in Puerto Rico to start the first companies that are going to integrate the SDGs, but more importantly, establish goals as well and measure those goals, be it by statistical indicators or KPIs, key performance indicators. We are also designing a social enterprise in order to help startups, small and medium businesses, and also NGOs on raising awareness on the SDGs, capacity building, recognizing leadership, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and policy dialogue. So this is something that we began working on in 2019, and we already have designed it, and we feel confident that we're going to be launching this LC3 in Puerto Rico. As we know, it's very much needed as private sector needs orientation on how to, one thing is the willingness to want to do something, but the other thing is the know-how on how to actually implement it. So we know that we are in the right track, as our first case study was an architectural firm in Puerto Rico, relatively small, a small business. Carla Joan Gonzalez was recently recognized, and Alvarez Diaz Villalon, by the UN Global Compact Network of the USA as one of the finalists of their SDG Pioneer Awards. And look how a company in an island was a finalist alongside Microsoft and PepsiCo. So we certainly, on islands, we might be small, but we also have things to show the world in terms of how to deal with these most important issues. Another important segment, without a doubt, is how to engage stakeholders. And we have done so since December 2017. We began the Puerto Rico SDG Working Group. This working group, it's now comprised by collaborators from over 100 NGOs, government agencies, academia, private sector, and cooperatives in 2021. And the mission is to unite stakeholders to promote, integrate, advance, measure, and finance the SDG locally. So it is an important component behind all these initiatives that we're doing. And one concrete thing that you could see it on the field working is how, as recent as March 30th of this year, several collaborators in this network, we received an invitation by the Honorable Senator Elizabeth Rosa. She happens to be the president of the Infrastructure, Innovation, Telecommunications, and Urbanism Commission of the Puerto Rico Senate. And precisely, we were talking and discussing SDG number 6, clean water and sanitation, particularly as Puerto Rico loses over 60% of the water it produces. So as Marlon also was mentioning, during that conversation, we actually mentioned US Virgin Islands rain harvesting initiative that Marlon mentioned before as an example that we have to adopt in Puerto Rico. So we were in that meeting with the commission. There were 2 members of the Committee of Experts on Advisors on Climate Change, meteorologist Adam Monzon, and the former director of the EPA in Puerto Rico, Carl Soderberg, along with myself. And on the same day, we also had a meeting with the Honorable Manuel Sidre, the Secretary of Economic Development, on the topic of the local 2030 Islands Network. So once again, just to highlight how this materializes from theory to practice. And finally, we have developed, in collaboration with a local advertising firm, we have designed and are already implementing a communication strategy on the SDGs under the brand ODS Puerto Rico, which is a Spanish acronym of the SDGs. So we already have platforms on Facebook, on Instagram, and soon we will have a website also. So I thank you all for your attention. I took a little bit more time than the speakers, considering that I was speaking for both subjects in terms of the Puerto Rico government and NGOs like the ones that I direct here in Puerto Rico. So this is our website if you want to know more information. And thank you so much. And looking forward for your questions.
Awesome. And I think the presentations will also be available later because there was a lot of information in yours, Ricardo, all of them actually. Excellent presentations. So we have a few minutes, I think about 15 minutes left for questions. I think what I heard there from all of the presenters is that there's some important things going on both in Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. In fact, a lot of activity. But I guess I want to dive a little bit into what are some of the gaps? What are the things, the barriers to progress? And I'd start there with you, Lloyd. And if you could also, I think we heard this idea about a voluntary local review. Talk through that a little bit and how you might measure SDG progress in the Virgin Islands as part of that process. So over to you, Lloyd.
Thanks.
And how do we measure that as part of measure progress as part of the voluntary local review? And maybe you could explain what that is.
Right. The countries that have signed on to this compact for Agenda 2030 are required or have agreed to actually conduct national reviews to track progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The compact also allows smaller communities or subnational bodies, cities, territories, tribal nations, etc., to do the same thing. And so that is voluntary, it's not part of the national process, but it is one of the ways recognized at the UN level for translating global to national to local. And so everywhere is different, and you want what you're doing to be relevant to the people who live in there. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So the process, the global process, recognizes and advocates for local reviews. We suggest, I would love to see one done as many places in the Caribbean as possible, certainly in the Virgin Islands. Well, that takes a number of things. One is a public conversation. As I said before, and as you've heard in Puerto Rico, you need to be able to talk through this to see how it applies based on the needs of the place and the systems you have in place. If it doesn't become part of the language, if people don't understand it, it doesn't happen. You also need a champion. I don't like the word champion, but you need in a place this small where the government is such a large part of the process, a driver essentially. You need a senior person in the public sector to act as a champion. It's nice to have them from the private sector and the public sector. I'm from civil society, but someone in the public sector who sees the need for long-term planning, for continuity, for determining, for basically tracking how things work. We need that kind of a champion, and maybe the person is there just doing something else. So I think that's a need, and we hope we can find one. But there's also, as Ricardo suggested, there's this process. How do you not just talk through it? So there's need for capacity for process management, for design and manage it over a long period. Like in many places, when you have changes in elections, things happen. They cause discontinuities. When you lose one talented person or you lose a champion for whatever reason, the process stalls. And so there needs to be institutional support and agreement across a number of institutions that regardless of whether you lose one person or there's an election or something happens, that there will be some continuity in the process so that the community can track how it goes forward. So there's that. There's capacity. It has to be linked into what the community is doing through the public policy, through agreed agendas in civil society. And so this issue of governance and participatory decision making in terms of where do we go, what are we doing, what are the most critical things, it is not just recover from storms. And recover from storms in what context? I mean, when we say build back better, what does that look like to a particular community? So those kinds of discussions need to take place. They need to be not moderated, but basically supported substantially in terms of technical expert bodies and resources allocated to it. And so we would like to help we meaning the FDPI, the Foundation for Development Planning, would like to help in that respect. What that means is where we are in the process is we're in the process of completing, should I say, under preparation is a concept paper that we want to share with the community. And in fact, we hope to launch publicly that discussion in July at we have our annual meeting, and there's a public session on the first day, and we hope to sort of talk to the community around that. In 2018, just after the storms, unfortunately, I attempted to restart something that another nonprofit has started, which is an alliance of civil society organizations. That was the wrong time because people said, listen, we really, really focus on this thing that just happened. We need to build our community back. I'm like, building back how? And it didn't work. So we tried that again last year. And I think that's where we are in the next step is to initiate that process, to re-engage around that discussion. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Lloyd. Marlon, I'm going to ask you a similar question, more from a government perspective, but what do you see as the gaps and how do we measure change and progress? So you had lots of great initiatives that are being done in the VI. How does that add up to a whole and link to the SDGs?
You know, Lloyd is correct. We and then Ricardo mentioned it about measuring. How do we measure, and how it requires, and Lloyd mentioned it, it requires a champion, for want of a better term, but it requires a collaborative effort between both the public and private sector and the community as a whole. I think Ricardo mentioned something that resonated with me, that there were 100-something NGOs in this partnership. And I'm thinking, okay, can I name 5? That would be, you know, appropriate. Yes, we have organizations doing very good work. You know, I can think of, I mentioned a few, the Virgin Islands Conservation Society, the St. Croix Environmental Association, the St. Croix Foundation. What I think is that we don't have that network or platform where they're all working together and saying, hey, government, can we help you attain these goals? Can we help you measure these things? I think their agencies, and I can't speak for all the agencies, but you know, DPNR, one of the planning agency, also needs to be measuring our own objectives and projects. You know, Lloyd spoke about program silos. We have that in this organization. We're trying to dispel it and break down those silos so that we're doing things seamlessly. It's under the current leadership, we are getting somewhere. You know, it's incremental. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think that's where we need to head, where every organization within GVI and our community are communicating. We're talking. What does Build Back Better really mean, as Lloyd mentioned a few minutes ago? What does that really mean for our community? Lloyd mentioned in his presentation the land and water use plan. Finally, Lloyd, I would love, I did not include it because I knew you probably would have. We are at the stage where we have selected a contractor, and we are at a stage where we are almost finished with the contract negotiations. And we hope that by around July, when you have that meeting, we'll be organizing some community meetings as well for this kickoff. And I think it's going to be the opportune time to develop an SDG network similar to our colleagues in Puerto Rico. You know, so we may have to adapt it to fit our context, but I think it's going to be an opportune time for both the recognition that it needs to, that measurement, that monitoring of our goals needs to be a collaborative effort. The community needs to play its role, the government needs to play its role, and that we are attaining goals, but it's piecemeal and we need a coordinated effort. So I believe that in the context of having this conversation today and having this conference now and the theme, it's an opportune time that an opportunity not to be missed by any of us right here on this panel or in this room together, now that we have made these connections. So I hope that helped to elucidate some of it.
Yes, perfect. And you've announced some things. That's awesome. In fact, the panel after this plenary, the plenary panel after this session will focus more on Local 2030 Islands Network with speakers from Hawaii and Guam. And you'll see what they've been doing. And I think it is along the track of what you're talking about. They had some of the same issues and are trying to work together to figure out how to deal with that. So I encourage people to stay on for that. I wanted to ask you though, Ricardo, in fact, we had a great question here in the chat from Alicia, which is how has COVID impacted progress or shifted the progress of SDG related efforts in Puerto Rico? Over to you.
Well, it has certainly affected us. I could only speak about the NGO perspective now, which is as myself as a director of an NGO. But let me tell you that at the same time, being forced to meet virtually, I have to say that this has been the most efficient 2 years that I have had on my 25 years as executive director at UNA USA Puerto Rico, because the plethora of meetings that we have done virtually to advance the initiatives that I was working and detailing before. Also, Kate is cognizant of this, as we have met several times in the context of Local 2030 and a network. And Kate is in New Zealand. And then we have Celeste in Hawaii. And then I'm in Puerto Rico and some others in the islands. So it's a great way to advance despite the obstacles, the inevitable obstacles that we faced during COVID. So I'm trying to give you a positive perspective, despite the awfulness and the devastation of COVID and this pandemic around the world. But I've had to also highlight that I have never met so many people and so many meetings in these past 2 years. So at least there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Time is of the essence, regardless of what happens. So we have to be cognizant of it. We have to be ambitious in the good sense of the word, because the challenges are enormous. And we just had to see the speakers in this conference 2 days to know the facts of where are we right now, and we have to move faster. So all these initiatives are great. It is great to hear that we have so many similarities, and looking forward to continue working with you, Kate, and now with Lloyd and Marlon. I have to also say before closing up that a bright spot that I see is a collaboration. You know, I'm seeing Marlon and Lloyd speaking, you know, Marlon from the government perspective and Lloyd, and also I mentioned some examples on how is this happening in Puerto Rico. I have to mention that as a bright spot, because as Lloyd mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, usually there's a disconnect between the government and there's no appreciation of the value that civil society can put forth. So this is another great lesson and something that we need to highlight going forward.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. And we're actually at the end of our time, and I think you did a wonderful job of energizing us with some great last energizing comments. I'm gonna, I think Lloyd has something he wants to say. Lloyd, over to you. Quickly.
Thanks. No, just once somebody raised the question of whether or not USV and Puerto Rico are SIDS. And I just put a link into the chat so that they can actually go check. And yes, we are considered SIDS.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. And with that, we'll close this session. We'll try and capture some of the questions that were answered in the chat. Please look out for the video of this session that will come out, and it will include the presentations. I really want to thank our speakers. As I said, I encourage you to make sure that you join the plenary session that is after this at 3:15, where we'll go a bit further with some examples from more broadly other US islands, and also the local 2030 Islands Network. So thank you very much to our speakers, to Lloyd, to Marlon and Ricardo. I think some really deep food for thought. I really take away the idea of the need to measure progress. The process is really important. And I think you've given us some great fodder for thinking about, even in the work that we do, how we apply some of the things that you've identified. So thank you to our audience, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.